Hello and welcome to the Girl Horror Podcast, the debut podcast from media review platform Glassbone Media. My name is Alice, and I'm a self-proclaimed film fanatic. I have a lot to say about most films I watch, but more than any other, I have the most to say about films that cross the intersection between girlhood and horror. In the Girl Horror Podcast, I will be walking and talking you through all aspects of girlhood as they are portrayed, prodded and dissected in horror cinema, for better and of course, for worse. Together, we'll be looking at the history of women in horror, from the whimsical damsel in distress to the empowered final girl, from eerie nunsploitation to the psychology of coming of age. We'll be looking at girl horror by genre, from slashers to zombie films, psychological films and body horrors, and of course, lots more. I'm full of thoughts and ideas, and I hope you'll come with me on this deep dive into girlhood and horror. In this introductory episode, I'm going to tell you about myself and my reason for starting the podcast, as well as looking at a brief history of women in horror, touching on some of the key moments that have contributed to the landscape of girl horror. The podcast will be broad in its parameters because I want to allow scope for new and unique ways to explore girlhood and horror as they walk hand in hand together into the sunset. Or maybe the dark and stormy night. Let's start by telling you a bit about myself. Who am I and why should you listen to what I have to say? I'll start from the beginning. As the youngest of my siblings, I've watched my fair share of horror media before I probably should have. I've always been easily scared, but I've also grown, perhaps as a coping mechanism, to sort of enjoy that artificial fear that horror media brings. My siblings will remember me watching Shaun of the Dead, might I add a parody of the supposedly scarier Dawn of the Dead, and ending up in tears and having nightmares.
Religious groups are calling it Judgment Day. There's panic on the streets of London as an increasing number of reports of serious attacks on people who are literally being eaten alive.
I grew up with a VHS room fitted with stacks on stacks of VHS videos and a staticky TV that you have to move a coat hanger antenna of when the screen crackles out. Fast forward through my life and I came to study film alongside other subjects while completing my bachelor's degree at university. Film and television, and the value of public service media in particular, ended up becoming the topic of my final dissertation. To my amazement, I finished university with a first-class degree. But before I knew it, I was bereft at what to do with my favourite hobby interest. That's when Glassbone Media was born.
Ma petite Amélie, vous n'avez pas des os en verre. Vous pouvez vous cogner à la vie. Si vous laissez passer cette chance, alors avec le temps, c'est votre cœur qui va devenir aussi sec et cassant.
Over at Glassbone, I've been diligently watching and reviewing films and TV media since November 2022. I watch and review films with no overarching theme other than every October being dedicated to spooky season. Now, I love Glassbone and I will always love Glassbone. It is absolutely going nowhere. But I've always wanted to dig a little deeper. I'm starting this podcast as a way to foster a creative community which explores lived experiences of girlhood through its portrayal in media. When it comes down to it, I think girlhood is horror. Don't get me wrong, there of course can be beauty and joy in it, and I do also want to talk about that as well. But girlhood as a concept, I think, is inherently horrific. So we can't talk about girl horror without looking at exactly what we mean when we say girlhood.
You're like really pretty.
Thank you.
So you agree?
What?
You think you're really pretty?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh my god, I love your bracelet. Where did you get it?
Oh, my mom made it for me.
It's adorable.
It's so fetch.
What is fetch?
Oh, it's like slang from England.
I think girlhood is a societal construct, largely a patriarchal construct, but it's also something that is very real in impacting the lived experiences of so many of us. Girlhood is a term often used by upper-class white women to the exclusion of anybody else. But in the era of girl dinner and girl maths, I want to try and reclaim girlhood in all its unfettered pain and twisted beauty for everybody. It's estimated that over 60% of horror fans identify as female, and that statistic in itself is fascinating. What is it that draws women to horror exactly? Well, I'm here to argue that if you have experienced girlhood in any way in your own life, you'll enjoy it being explored on the big screen in all its glory and all its gore. Girlhood insinuates innocence, pink frills and unassuming smiles, but if you've lived girlhood, you'll know that is so far from the truth. Women live with the expectation of innocence, but struggle with the real experience of life in a world that's not particularly favourable to us. I think we all are the final girl just trying to survive despite it all. So why not have some fun while we're here?
I only eat popcorn at the movies.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
I don't know.
You have to have a favorite. What comes to mind?
Girlhood is the manic pixie dream girl. It's the puppy eyes and vulnerability, but it's also the rage and the power. It's the battleground of our bodies and our sexualities. Girlhood is being a daughter, a sister, a mother. Girlhood is Mean Girls and Gilmore Girls, but it's also Carrie and Jennifer's Body. Whether it's white dresses and ribbons or red lipstick and bloodstains, girlhood as a phenomena is something we all experience in one way or another. It's a concept that is undeniably explored from top to bottom in horror cinema, and that's why I think it deserves talking about.
Better, I don't want to end up like Mom, or I want to be dancing up on the screen like the pretty girls in the pictures. I want what they have so badly. To be perfect. To be loved from as many people as possible to make up for all my time spent suffering. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night and the fear washes over me, because what if this is it? I'm a failure. I'm not pretty. I'm naturally pleasant or friendly. I'm not smart or funny or confident. I'm exactly what Mama said I was, weak.
Okay, so we've looked at the concept of girlhood. So now let's talk about women in horror. Women in horror have always been a complex reflection of societal attitudes towards gender, sexuality, and power. And I think it's important to begin this podcast series looking at the journey girl horror has taken in history. Although it starts out looking quite bleak, I would like to make a point to say that horror cinema is a genre that actually has put women at the forefront far more than lots of other genres have. Before we had the big screen, we had horror literature. There are reams of incredible female authors who've written some of the most well-known horror stories in living memory. Whether it's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Daphne du Maurier's The Birds, I think the roots of horror media undoubtedly were grown in part by women. In the early days of cinema, women in horror were often the victims of the story, or playing the damsel in distress. Historically, women have been symbols more than they've been complex characters. They've been put into a film as a way to serve the development of plot or even often usually male characters. It makes sense that in a society that places women as lesser, that media would do the same. Films were likely made by men and also for men, and I would argue that's a horror in itself.
Brain of yours and understand what makes you do these crazy, twisted things.
Gregory, are you trying to tell me I'm insane?
It's what I'm trying not to tell myself.
But that's what you think, isn't it?
Once the film industry takes off and we hit the 1950s and 60s, we can really start to see some more interesting and three-dimensional depictions of women in horror. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of damsels about, but with the likes of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960 and Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby from 1968, we definitely see more complex female characters coming to the foreground of horror film. The characters in these films start to grapple with some of the topics I mentioned earlier, exploring their own psychology and playing around with the societal expectations of the time. Once we hit the 1970s and the rise of exploitation cinema, the dabbling of strong female characters in horror is already pushed the other way. Female characters were often over-sexualized and exploited to the point of controversy. These films were trying to make a point, to get a reaction. By the end of the 70s, we meet the final girls of horror. In 1978, the first Halloween film comes out and introduces us to one of the most iconic final girls in the history of horror. If you're not familiar with the term, the final girl trope describes the female protagonist who survives all the horrors of the story despite everything being pitted against her. You'll hear me mention final girls a lot, so it's worth getting used to the term. The final girl is strong and resilient. She's cunning and clever. She survives against all the odds. The 70s also gave us the likes of Carrie, who many see as the original monster heroine. Carrie is just an innocent girl, but she's also a monster who lives in fear of herself and what the world around her expects. If that's not girlhood, I don't know what is.
You must renounce this power. You must give it up. You must never use it.
I'm going. You can't stop me. I don't want to talk about it anymore.
Carrie does not fall flat of overdone horror tropes because it's a film about a girl becoming a woman in a world that's less than kind to girls becoming women. Something girlhood. As we get closer to modern horror, we finally see a transition in which women start to be behind the camera and in the director's chair. I think girl horror has truly opened up in the past 20 years because of this shift. Mary Shelley would be proud. This change has given us lots more nuanced portrayals of women in horror and allowed the concept of girl horror to truly flourish. I'm hoping to do an episode solely discussing female directors and the impact that having women in production has had on the portrayal of girlhood on the big screen. I'm going to stay quite vague about girl horror from the 90s to now because firstly there's far too much to put into a soundbite for you, but also that's largely where this podcast is going to sit. Now we've set the scene, we'll be looking at films in context of where they've come from. In future episodes of this podcast, I want to talk about how horror media approaches coming of age and discovering yourself. Bodies, sex, periods, but also relationships and stereotypes and societal expectation. How does horror cinema approach empowerment and agency? How does it address the lifespan of girlhood from the young and naive to the old, the wise, the haggard? We'll talk about the archetype of caregiver as well as what happens when women reject girlhood altogether. Inevitably, we will spend some time talking about trauma and healing, both of which I think are intrinsically part of the experience of girlhood, but also that are often the focus and exploitation of depictions of girlhood on the big screen. Arguably, the real meat of the discussion about girlhood and horror cinema comes when we look at the impact these depictions have had and continue to have on societal perceptions of girlhood, and most importantly on lived experiences of girlhood. Girl horror films both reinforce and also liberate women from stereotypes. They help to flesh out the complexities of women in the minds of the audience, and yet they also contribute to the normalization of violence against women and girls too. What a dichotomy. Girl horror gives us huge and undeniable knock-on effects to body image and self-esteem, in the positive and in the negative. Some stories make us feel strong, powerful, beautiful. Others make us feel monstrous, ugly, and worthless. Some films make us want to feel beautiful, and others make us want to be the monster.
No, I'm a star! Please, I'm a star!
I'm sorry.
Make us realise we all have a bit of Carrie in us. All of this turmoil whilst simultaneously centring the quote-unquote girl as both the victim and the heroine of horror. Now that all sounds like a lot, which it is, but don't worry, this podcast is going to be more fun than it is, well, horrible. If this sounds like your proverbial cup of tea, then I sincerely hope you'll join me to discuss some more of these topics in the future. To use the concept of girlhood as a kind of lens through which to dissect and analyse classic horror, niche horror, and even some films you might not think of as horror at all.
You're wearing sweatpants. It's Monday.
So?
So that's against the rules, and you can't sit with us.
Whatever. Those rules aren't real. They were real that day I wore a vest. Because that vest was disgusting.
You can't sit with us!
To give you a brief idea of what I want future episodes to look like, I'm going to tell you how I want to go about reviewing films on the Girl Horror podcast. Each episode will have a film as its focus, and I'll be dissecting it with a girl horror lens, looking at which tropes it explores and how well it manages to do so. I'll be comparing that film to others that approach the same topics, trying to flesh out where the film sits in the overarching story of girl horror. The episodes won't just be a straight-cut review of whether you should watch it or not. I'll be putting these films in context of girlhood as it stands today. In our first full episode together, we'll be discussing the newly released nunsploitation masterpiece that is Immaculate.
You are with child.
Why did he choose me?
God saved you. This is it. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
All I'll say now is that Sydney Sweeney has officially secured her spot in the Hall of Scream Queen fame. I can't wait to get into this film with you, so if you haven't seen it already, then get watching. If you can't wait for our episodes to come out, or you're looking for a bit of homework, then don't forget to look at the Girl Horror Homework film list, which you can find as a letterbox link on the Glassbow Media website. As time goes on, I'll be putting together specialised watch lists for different kinds of girl horror films, as well as playlists of music that I think give the right atmosphere for these topics. I'm someone who likes to embody a film if it hits a spot for me, and that means walking down the street blasting The Season of the Witch or another apt song for a week afterwards. The website page for the Girl Horror podcast on the Glassbow Media website will become a hub of resources for you to explore more yourself. There's so much coming your way in the coming months if girl horror is something that scratches the itch for you like it does for me. If you're impatient to get going with horror podcasts more generally, then I want to point you towards the Evolution of Horror podcast from the incredible Mike Munzer. This is probably the only podcast that I go back to time and time again because it has an episode about what feels like every horror film under the sun, and it's so accessible regardless of your level of film buffery. With incredible guest discussions and interviews with the likes of Anna Bogatskia and the Final Girls podcast, as well as many others, Evolution of Horror has undoubtedly inspired me to embark on my own journey with the Girl Horror podcast. So thank you, Mike and co. Keep doing what you're doing. And now, thank you. If you've listened this far and you're excited to dive into the Girl Horror podcast with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences, your reactions and analysis. So please get in touch if you have any additions to make, films to suggest, or topics you'd like to see covered in the future. It takes a village. Don't forget to check out our Instagram at Girl Horror and choose your fighter from the ever-increasing list of iconic girls in horror we're showcasing there. You can find out more about us on the Girl Horror section of the Glassbow Media website, as I mentioned before, which you'll find a link for in the description of this episode. Finally, a huge thank you for listening. Please do subscribe to the podcast so you can find future episodes more easily. Episodes will be released every other Wednesday, with the potential for bonus episodes and new release reaction episodes in between. I will see you next time when we'll be discussing Immaculate. Until then, stay girly, stay horrifying.